Bonjour, goedemiddag. Merci beaucoup d'être venu aujourd'hui. I'll switch to English because today is the third session of our lunch session over extreme violence, over violent online political extremism with our partner VOX-Pol. I will let Liz introduce the speaker today, and if you have questions afterwards, you can ask them either in French or Dutch, and I can translate them in English or directly in English as you prefer. And after today's intervention, we'll have a networking lunch next door. Thank you.
Thanks, Nadej. Thanks, everybody, for coming. I'm Liz Pearson, and I'm here each week for each of the lunch briefing seminars. Today is the third. Next week, we have a break, and then we recommence on November the 8th. And each presentation is a presentation of research funded by VOX-Pol, which is based in Dublin and is a European Union-funded network of excellence looking at online political extremism. This week we have Dr. Paul Gill. He's a senior lecturer in security and crime science at University College London, which is one of VOX-Pol's partner institutions, and he will be talking about lone actor terrorism. Please feel free to tweet. You can use the hashtags which are on the wall here, and Paul is on Twitter as @PaulGill_UCL. So I will, without further ado, hand over to Paul. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Liz. Can everybody hear me okay? Do I need a mic? Alright. If my Irish accent gets in the way of clarity at any point, please do wave at me and tell me to slow down. So I started doing research on lone actor terrorism in early 2011. At the time, I worked in America alongside a guy called John Horgan, who's one of the leading experts on the psychology of terrorism. And we were surveying different intelligence and policing forces in Europe and in the United States, asking them, where do you feel more research needs to be done? And the answer that kept on coming back at us, particularly from US practitioners, was in this area of lone actor terrorism, or what they used to popularly call lone wolf terrorism. So we pitched a one-year project which began in August 2011. When we pitched the project, we thought this is going to be a really easy one-year project, in and out, answer all the questions. They're quite simple, and then we can get back to doing stuff on the Irish Republican Army and other interesting aspects. About a month before the project began, Anders Breivik stepped out the door of his house and engaged in a bombing and a shooting attack and killed over 70 people in one day. And it brought home the sort of very seriousness of this type of threat. And despite us thinking it was going to be a one-year project, it's now spun into about 6 years worth of projects funded by a suite of different organisations. So the initial project was funded by Homeland Security and the UK Home Office, and then we've had follow-on studies with the Defence Science Tech Lab, European Union. One project is VOX-Pol, another one is Prime, which we lead. We've also been funded by National Institute of Justice, and I work very closely with the Greater Manchester Police's North West County Terrorism Unit. Our first project kind of almost opened up more questions than answers, which has then led into a series of other studies. So, for example, the very first study was really about developing a database of lone actor terrorists, and to try and understand what behaviours did they engage in prior to their attack and during their radicalisation, and how can this inform risk assessment, threat management, countering violent extremism type initiatives. We then dug down deeper and engaged in some case studies with the DSTL project. On VOX-Pol, we looked at 200 individuals convicted of terrorism related offences, with a particular focus on what were they doing online, what were their behaviours online, what did their online radicalisation look like, and did lone actors look different than group actors in terms of what they did online. We also, for National Institute of Justice, we built a control group, comparison group of school shooters and marauding shooters in the United States, people that killed 4 or more people in a 24-hour period but did it absent of a political cause. So did it because it was workplace violence, school shooting, some sort of personal grievance. And then with the Greater Manchester Police, on a project called Project Regulus, we were given access to 50 lone actors in terms of their closed source intelligence, so police files, intelligence files, court documents and all that type of thing, to get a sense of whether there is more answers to be found in closed source compared to open source. So that's basically what I'm going to talk to you today about. So over the last few years, we've looked at over 140 lone actor terrorists based on open source information. We've now looked at 50 based on closed source, and we've looked at 115 US mass murderers. When we started this project, we wanted to build this database. So we built a codebook which had 185 questions, all related to radicalization, socio-demographic characteristics, what these guys did. It was a real focus on behavior. And we pulled those questions from the wider literature, and we pulled those questions after consultation with the likes of FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, people like that. Which leads to sort of 8 key findings. And the online radicalization stuff is kind of dotted right the way through these findings. Really, we do have more than 8 key findings, but this template of Prezi only has 8 circles. So we're going to focus in on the main 8 findings. But what I will say before we go into that is that at the moment, a lot of people are talking about lone actor terrorism as if it's a brand new phenomenon, and that its relationship with online sphere is brand new. In reality, the two of them have lived side by side since the early 1990s. The lone wolf idea would have been nothing without the internet back in the day. So the whole idea originally came from this small, obscure pamphlet called The Seditionist. And the guy who wrote it, Louis Beam, basically makes the point that in the early 90s, US government is too strong for formal groups to survive. That if a group wants to overthrow the system, the mechanisms that the US government has to detect you and to know what you're saying to everybody is too great. So we need to rely on lone actors and small cells. And then that idea basically went viral in the early days of the internet, with people like Tom Metzger and Alex Curtis, who ran extreme right websites in the very early days of the internet. And Alex Curtis had a particularly popular podcast before they were even called podcasts, where he really heavily promoted this lone wolf idea. And they even came up with lone wolf point scoring systems, where it gave budding would-be lone wolves, you know, here's a set of goals for you to hit, and if you get a high value target, you get 10 points. If you avoid detection, you get 5 points. So they tried to gamify it. And it's very, very similar. The advice that they were giving would-be lone actors is almost identical to the advice you see in today's The Beak and Inspire magazines. In terms of the types of attacks, the tactics are more or less a copy and paste from what the extreme right were saying in the early 90s, and certainly from what the anti-abortionist movements were saying for lone wolves to engage in through the mid to late 90s. So it's nothing new here. It's just been it's been happening a long, long time. The major difference is that now there's a bigger spread of those ideas because it's easier to hit bigger populations via social media, via Twitter. So it's just the mechanisms through which they are pushing these ideas just have a greater global coverage, basically, compared to sort of they were quite obscure websites back in the day and you had to know where to look. Okay, so 8 key findings, and we're going to talk about how the internet relates to most of these as we go through. So when we started this research, we were based in America, and when we'd go and give talks to local law enforcement, the very first question we would always get would be, what's the lone actor terrorist profile? So we always have to start this project, these presentations, by saying there is none, just to preempt your question. So I think in American law enforcement, they are obsessed with criminal minds and shows like that. We had just about every socio-demographic example you could think of within our data set. We've seen 15-year-olds, we've seen 68-year-olds, we've seen PhD graduates, we've seen high school dropouts, we've seen people that were happily married and people that were basically single right the way throughout their whole adult life. Every single demographic characteristic you can think of, we saw in our data. So there's no sort of socio-demographic profile. But I will say something about age, because it's quite interesting, because it bucks the trend of what we usually see. So in criminology, I'm a sort of an applied criminologist. In criminology, they're seen as this golden rule called the it's such a golden rule, I can't even remember what it's called. Age decay, right? So it's basically, if you look at any sample of offenders, the vast majority of them will be like 18 to 22. And as they get older, you see less and less first-time offenders. And that also applies to terrorist group members. So we've done studies of provisional IRA. The vast majority of them, their first-time offence was in that very young age group. And other studies on ETA, Al-Qaeda, of terrorist groups find that same age decay function. Lone actors do not represent that whatsoever. The average age was 35, starting to change a little bit, I'll talk about that in a minute. The average age was 35, which may give you a sense that there's a different set of pressures, a different set of vulnerabilities behind their radicalisation if they're on the older age curve. So, for example, from a psychological perspective, young people, particularly men, higher sensation seekers, bigger risk takers, more likely to conform to group authority, more likely to go along with what their friends are doing. You sort of lose those influences as you get older. So there's a different, what we see with our guys that are in their mid-30s and onwards, there's a very different set of stressors and vulnerabilities pushing them down towards radicalisation. But I will say that that profile is getting younger, and it's largely related to online routine activities. So there's a greater and greater density of younger guys in our sample population from the last few years. There's a guy just arrested in London in the last couple of days, a 19-year-old who allegedly planted a bomb on the Jubilee underground system. And we're finding more of it with the consultancy work on the ground. And it's really intricately tied to what they're doing during their routine activities, during their day. They're spending a lot of time online, and they're becoming exposed to these kind of radicalising narratives. There isn't really a profile, like a behavioural profile into lone actor terrorism as well, except to say that at the time when they adopt their radicalisation, when they adopt the ideology, when they plan to do an attack, not everything is right at home. So most of them have multiple personal stressors, vulnerabilities, financial stressors, interpersonal relationship issues going on, breakdown in family relationships, breakdown in loving relationships, whatever. Not everything is right, and it's in that phase when all those things are crystallizing at the same time that the ideology or the idea to do an attack seems like a good idea. So it's sort of like, you know, if my immune system goes down, we can bet with fairly good confidence that I'm going to get sick, but we don't know what I'm going to get sick with unless you know what I'm being exposed to. So it's the exposure that leads, so it's the vulnerabilities coupled with the exposure that leads to a certain sort of thing to happen to me. And that's often what we see with these guys, is that they're highly vulnerable at that phase when they go down that kind of radicalisation path. But maybe not being exposed to it, or maybe when they are exposed, treating some of those vulnerabilities might have pushed them away from that kind of radicalisation curve. So it has big impacts from a sort of CVE perspective. So that finding really did not surprise us, but the big one that did hugely took us by surprise was the degree to which somebody knew something in the build-up. So the big kind of worries that law enforcement were telling us in the build-up was, what if our tools that we use to detect and interdict group-based activities, what if they're no longer applicable because these guys are so alone? And we found, well, really, they're not that alone. Most of the time, somebody knows something. And in 60% of the cases, just under, somebody knew something specific about the plot. So it wasn't like, oh, I knew he was annoyed about something, I knew he had an extreme ideology. It was, he told me that he was going to do something that Tuesday, and I didn't report it to the police, or I did report it and it ended up being interdicted. So a big example, again, a recent conviction in the UK, a guy called Rustam Ziamani, another 19-year-old. In the build-up to his attack, he said to his girlfriend, you know, next week I'm going to do a Lee Rigby, meaning I'm going to do a copycat attack of the Woolwich attack. and I'm going to put the picture of a soldier's head, decapitated head, up on Instagram. And, you know, luckily she raised an eyebrow and thought, this is very concerning. She told the police and intelligence forces. They did a remote assessment and decided to interdict. When they disrupted him, when they went to arrest him, he was in his driveway of his house. He had a backpack on his shoulder. He had an ISIS flag in it, a hammer, and a long kind of hunting knife. He was on his way to try and do something. So that's the kind of fine lines that we're dealing with lone actors. Because previously, with big, you know, organised, command and control, centred plots, intelligence agencies have a good chance of being able to interdict those communications. But when it's one individual by themselves, they're leaking it. It's really soft pieces of intelligence. They're telling loved ones, they're telling friends and families that they're planning on going down this route. And they largely do it for two reasons, I think. One, they don't want to be lone actors. They want to have somebody come along and do it with them to sort of help get them over the hurdle. And two, they almost need to know, they need people to know why they're doing it. Because otherwise, it could be just treated as some sort of a personal grievance, you know, the acts of a madman. It's not given that sort of wider arc of he's a martyr for this movement and there's a sort of a long line of individuals that he's following, and you know, his social status online isn't going to be, you know, promoted by these other extremists. Because that's what they kind of want at the end of the day. Yeah, they might believe in the ideology a little bit, but there's a lot of sort of social status being sought with these individuals, that renown and being remembered afterwards. So in about 60% of the cases, they leak something really specific to their friends and family, and school shooters do the same. And in 63% of the cases, there's an identifiable bystander, which is a different thing. So whereas in this case, they're told something really specific about what they want to do, in this case, somebody in the neighbourhood knows, you know, has witnessed something that was a real red flag, but has decided not to report it. So for example, again, looking at the Charlie Hebdo attacks, the neighbour next door had broken into the brother's house because he was concerned about their behaviour, and he wanted to have a little look around to see whether his concerns were right. He saw the cache of weapons. One of the brothers said to him, you know, one of the brothers came back, interrupted him, and said, if you tell anybody, you know, bad things are going to happen to you. And he went back into his house and didn't report anything. And that was 2 months before the Charlie Hebdo attacks. Both of those guys were on the intelligence radar. If he had have reported it, I saw weapons in the house, all of a sudden they're seen as high risk, and there's boots on the floor, you know, within minutes, within hours. Because it's that sort of level of triage that intelligence analysts are doing, and they're really reliant on these really soft pieces of intelligence. So that's the big challenge that law enforcement has right now, is how can we incentivize bystanders who have real concerns to come forward and sort of report their concerns. And in the UK, they've been quite lucky in terms of disrupting lone actor plots or small, you know, groups of two plots. But they've kind of made their own look. One example was in Bolton in the northwest. There was a married couple who were planning on bombing a synagogue and other places related to the Jewish faith. And towards the end of the plot, the pressure got to the husband, and he beat up his wife. She called her family members, who then called the police. Police car pulls up outside, and a neighbour comes out and says, oh, so you're finally going to do something about those bombs? The policeman said, what bombs? I'm here for something else. He said, oh, they've been letting off bombs in their back garden for the last few weeks. You know, that's what we're dealing with here, right? You know, that's pure luck that a really significant plot wasn't, you know, didn't come to fruition. So generally somebody knows something. For me, it's not always purely ideological. For me, most of these lone actors that step over the Rubicon and look to do violence, they often have something that's really deeply personalised within their grievance. So this is a right-wing extremist, and I'll read what he says, and Lizzie can make these slides available. They're freely available online. So he's a right-wing extremist, and on the day of his attack, he leaves a 6-page note in his house. And it starts off by saying, to whom it may concern, I guess you're wondering why I did this. Well, let me explain in detail. Over the years, I've had some good jobs, but I always got laid off. Now I'm 58, and I can't get a decent job. I'm told I'm overqualified. which is a code word for too damn old. Like him, expected to age gracefully into poverty. No thanks, I'm done. So the first page really reads like a suicide note. The second page, he tries to explain why he can't get a job, why he's lost his job, and the basic explanation is America, the federal government is decaying its moral, nature, and the church is also in moral decay. I'm gonna punish either the state or the church for the position that I'm in right now. And then he sort of goes out, decides I'm going to do an attack on a church, gets into his car, drives past the first church, drives past the second church, drives past the third church, goes into the fourth church and shoots that place up. What was the difference between that church and the other three? Well, that's where his recently divorced wife went to mass, right? So he's building all these personal grievances, the wife that left him, and him losing his job, and he found in the ideology something that helped explain why he was in that position at that time. And I think if you look at many sort of young radicalized Muslims in Europe, it's a similar thing. They're finding that they have all these kind of stressors going on in their personal life, and in that kind of ISIS message or jihadist message, it explains why young Muslim men are being treated like that by the West, and it helps wrap up their personal grievance into this grander ideology. So it's not always just purely ideology for me. I think more so I'd be on the case that it's the personal grievances that are really the cause of the cause. And I also don't think we can underestimate that sort of fame aspect. They're looking for their name, they're looking to be remembered in the immediate aftermath. They're worried about their status, and I could talk about that at length. Again, things are starting to change a little bit. So 2 years ago, when we kind of wrapped up the first big study, we said that rarely attacks were sudden and impulsive. Usually there was a long lag between the moment they said, I'm going to do something violent, and the day they stepped out the door. In many cases, there was like a 3-year lag, 3 years of planning and preparation, 2 years of planning and preparation. And that's kind of good news from an intelligence perspective, because it gives you more time to identify them, to sort of remotely watch it, and to then decide when to interdict. But things are changing at a quicker rate now. Rustam Ziamani, the example I said with the backpack and the ISIS flag and the hammer and the knife, 3 months prior to that day in the driveway, he was a Jehovah's Witness. So in 3 months, he converted, radicalized, chose an attack plan, built the preparation, and stepped out his door. And again, the internet is a large driver of that, because it's making things easier. Like in most of our routine day-to-day activities, our life is easier because of the internet. For people looking to do malevolent things, it's also a lot easier. At the start of this lecture, I said that this lone wolf online radicalization thing is nothing new. It's been going since the early 90s. One of the things that the right-wing extremists and anti-abortionists and the environmentalists and now the jihadists all have in common when they've written their strategy documents about why lone wolf is the way to go, is they said to would-be lone wolves, don't do big attacks, don't do big things, because you're going to get detected. Do small scale, low key, small technology, run people over, do things like that, because the ability for intelligence to detect you is minimal. The right-wing guys didn't get people out the door. They had the same message, they just couldn't get people out to do it. Anti-abortionists, the same. Environmentalists, Al-Qaeda in the early days got a couple people, but none of them really became seen as big heroes of the movement. Things have changed recently with ISIS. And again, people will say it's because of their HD videos. They run great Instagram accounts, all that. I think it's kind of nonsense myself. What I really believe is that simply there's two factors. The reason why all those groups couldn't get people out the door to do things was because the guy on the street who was going to do the violence was thinking, what's in it for me? I don't want to do lots of little attacks. I want to do one big attack and for my name to be remembered and to go down in the history of terrorism as a particularly bad guy and somebody that others would want to replicate. Doing stuff and not getting caught just didn't really work for them, because the personal stuff, the social status is what they wanted. So that didn't incentivize people. But the attack in Woolwich, where Lee Rigby was killed by Michael Adebowale and Michael Adebolajo, they were the ones that figured it out. How can I do something that's small scale, low key, hard to detect, which is what the leaders want us to do, but at the same time gets us mass exposure, public renown, and infamy. They did it in a highly public place, knowing that in today's culture, some idiot is going to record you on a mobile phone. In 24-hour rolling news coverage where they're competing against each other, some idiot TV director is going to put it on screen, and that they're going to live down in infamy. But the two guys did the attack. They both drove the car, they both got out, they both tried to decapitate Lee Rigby and ultimately killed him. One of them is seen as a hero amongst jihadists. He's the guy that got in front of the camera with the bloodied hands. The other one is really forgotten about. He's 40 yards back, he's staring at his shoes, he's heavily mentally disordered. They both did the attack, which is both supposedly great for the ideology and great for the movement, but it's the guy with the bloodied hands in front of the camera that the other guys want to follow. Siamani, again the guy with the backpack, he learnt off the speech word for word. He wanted to recreate that whole scene. So it was the Woolwich guys for me, more than ISIS, that kind of cracked. How can we do stuff that's low scale, hard to detect, but highly publicly visible, so that everybody's happy? So things are changing, because now that they can do small scale plan A's, it's really condensed the amount of time, the planning necessary. And again, the internet has helped facilitate a lot of that. In 1999, David Copeland wanted to do a series of big car bombings around London, and he got his hands on a bomb making manual, which he got online. He got all the components together, he tried to build a bomb, but he couldn't do it. In his own words, he found it too complex. He said that there was the bomb making manual that he was following, he couldn't transition from stage 3 to stage 4. That basically whatever consistency the mixture had at the end of stage 3, it had changed by stage 4, and there was no information to say how do you get from that to that. It was like in a liquid state towards a more sort of harder congealed state, and he didn't know how to do it. 12 years later, Anders Breivik is looking at the same bomb making manual and faces the exact same problem. I couldn't transition from stage 3 to stage 4. So he puts it into Google and he finds a YouTube video, and there's a guy looking down the camera saying, oh, so you can't transition between stage 3 and stage 4 either. Here's how you do it. Camera pans over his shoulder, the mix is in a state, he puts something else in it, and then you're ready to go. You're now on stage 4. So again, it's really condensed the amount of time, effort, and it's increased the know-how of these individuals. So we've done a comparative study comparing our lone actor terrorists with other lone actors who are not like politically inspired, and really we barely found any differences. They're basically the same individual, but they were exposed to different things when those vulnerabilities were down. So in terms of risk factors in the build-up, no difference. In terms of the numbers of vulnerabilities, no difference. In terms of age profiles, no difference. In terms of educational profiles, rates of mental health, no difference. There was only two differences. Lone actor terrorists generally tend to tell people, on average, a little bit more. You know, they tend to leak that information. And lone actors typically tend to engage in violence at a place that they've never been to before. So they need to do like hostile reconnaissance, whereas your mass murderers do it in places where they have lots of their routine activities, schools, close to home, workplaces. But really, in terms of their violent radicalization, very little difference. In terms of online stuff, very little difference. Even people that are personally aggrieved, what you're finding now is they're finding like-minded people on an online space. So there's a sample of individuals in the United States that have gone on mass shooting sprees at university campuses because they believe that the government has a mind control machine on them, and that the government is piping voices into their head. Really what they are is paranoid schizophrenics. But on the online space, they found a lot of other paranoid schizophrenics who are all suffering from the same thing, so now they believe they're part of a whole wider movement, and many of them have now stepped out the door and done violence to get the government to turn the mind control machine off. And they share the same websites, they're on the same forums, they're all talking about their little experiences. It's the same thing. But one's political, one's fairly apolitical, but the behaviours, what they do, their planning, their dedication, what they do in an online space is exactly the same. But we call one online radicalisation, whereas we call something else. Skip over that. Mental health issues are really, really complex. I think I've only got 2 more slides, right?
5 minutes.
5 minutes, alright. mental health issues are really complex in relation to our lone actor terrorists. In the round, between 30 and 40% of our guys have a diagnosed mental health disorder in the build-up prior to their attack, right? So they're in the system already. What I would say is there's a lot of sort of mass media interpretations of if there's a mental health problem, that means surely they must be irrational. Again, that's nonsense, right? We found that our guys that have mental health problems, sometimes their mental health problems can be really specifically make them even more rational in their planning. So if they're having a fixation with a cause and that sort of obsessional thinking, that could really help their planning. It doesn't lead to irrationality, it might lead to better rationality. And also, in the build-up or in the aftermath of attacks, they say, look, there was a mental health problem. That's the cause. Most of the time, that's just one vulnerability coupled on with a number of other issues that are happening to that individual. Sometimes it might be a cause of a cause of a cause of a cause, right? It might be just the start of the chain that led to a series of unfortunate events that then led to the exposure. But the base rate within a normal developed society of mental health problems is in around 25%. 1 in 4 people will go through their lives and have a mental health disorder. When we compare it against different groups of terrorists, we find that rates of mental disorder diagnosis is very, very different. So their mass shooters are sort of non-politically aligned. It's just under 50%. With our lone actor terrorists, around 40%. We also coded a type of guy which we call our solo actor. So they're individuals that did the violence by themselves, but had some training by a group prior. So that's below the base rate, that's at 20%. We also coded for lone dyads, so like the Kouachi brothers that showed up Charlie Hebdo and the husband and wife team. Again, it's much lower than the base rate, at about 5%. And we looked at terrorist group actors, and again, it's much lower than the base rate. So what we're finding is that there's this kind of relationship. The more co-offenders you have, the less likely that there's going to be a presence of a mental health issue going on. So there's a sort of relationship between the two. And also, it really depends on what the diagnosis is. In our lone actor sample, there is significantly higher rates of schizophrenia, delusional disorders, autism spectrum. Significantly lower levels of things like anxiety disorders, sleep disorders, and things like that, right? So it really depends on what the content is. And some of them might be really related to online behaviours. So there is a big bit of literature that talks about how people with autism spectrum, they can really thrive in online environments. And that sort of fixation that comes with the diagnosis can really help with fixating upon particular causes. Whereas in face-to-face dynamics, they don't thrive, but online they can. So again, it's about having those vulnerabilities mixed with the exposure, helps push you down the line. So I've kind of mentioned this a few times, but it's often a sort of a cause of a cause of a cause. And really what we find is that closer to the attack it becomes, that's when the online stuff really kind of comes to the fore. It's not just about ideology, but it's also about attack planning. And then finally, I think this term called online radicalization is a bit of a misnomer. I think it's a bad term in relation to lone actors. When we look at our lone actors and they decide to interact with people online, like on online forums, it's not a case of am I going to interact online or offline. If they decide to interact, they're going to do it in both places, we find. But they're compartmentalizing what they're doing. So me and Lizzie might be hanging out online talking about why the UK should leave Europe, right? But I might be hanging out with somebody else face to face talking about how to make better bombs. So you are unaware of my bomb maker friend is unaware of the grievance that I hold. So they sort of compartmentalize it. And most of the thing, you know, if you're Skyping somebody face to face in Syria, I mean, is that online, is that offline? I mean, the two worlds aren't as sort of distinct as we might think. So it's a bit of a misnomer because most of the time the online activities co-occur with offline activities, and it's about how those two things blend together, gives us a sense of who's going to go down that line. Again, some of the work that we've done, which I can answer in Q&As or whatever, we've looked at some of the stuff that people have been doing online, so about their sort of obsessional focus, and it's about sort of proactively going out and looking for this kind of material. But I'm running out of time, so thank you. If you have any questions, I'm here for a little bit. And there's open, so this Prezi is freely available online. We've got 2 and 3 page briefing notes for those of you who are practitioners. For those of you who are students, we've published it in a number of different domains, so basically you can pick and choose whatever you want depending on your time sources. Thanks very much for your time.
Thanks, Paul. We've got about 25 minutes for questions before we break for lunch. I just want Paul, on the mental health issue, which has been very much focused on by policymakers, particularly at the moment with ISIS. Can you just put that in perspective? Because that 30 to 40%, what percentage of the terrorist population would be lone actors?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. It's still a low base rate. I mean, lone actors, although it's grabbing a lot of the kind of media attention, it's still far lower than the number of people that have travelled over to Syria to try and join ISIS and things like that. So it still is much, much lower globally, internationally. There has been some good work done in the Netherlands, looking at police files again, which shows that some of those same mental health disorders in relation to people that have gone to join Syria or ISIS in Syria, like schizophrenia was a significantly higher rate. I think the autism spectrum finding as well. So these guys in the Netherlands have basically replicated our findings, but with foreign fighters.
Which study was that?
Anton Wiening.
Okay.
And then there's another study which is coming out, which looks at people that have gone through counter-radicalisation programs in the UK, and you'll find similarly high rates of mental health issues going on there, which is being published in the near future by another research team.
Okay, thank you. So if we take questions in threes, and so we've got one here, and one there. Let's start here. Hi. Please say your name and where you represent as well.
My name is Caroline Gerard. I work for the Global Forum for Media Development.
And louder, sorry.
Global Forum for Media Development.
Thanks, Nadej.
How does that inform the policies that are applied in different countries on countering radicalization online? Because it seems that those policies are irrelevant.
Yeah, and then behind you, if you could.
Hello, I'm Julia Giacomelli from the General Secretariat of the Council. I have a question. So you mentioned that social demographic factors are not fundamental. I was wondering whether there is a gender issue there. And I mean, if you carried out this kind of study. And I had another question, but now I don't forget it. I forgot it, so that maybe I will follow up.
Thanks.
There was a third question.
Hi, thank you for the talk. It was really interesting. My name is Sandy Schumann. I'm a social psychologist at the University of Oxford. And if I understood you right, you mostly focus on micro-level, individual level processes and factors. And I was just wondering whether in your research there also where you came across societal level factors and processes that did play a role. So personally, I'm quite interested in segregation, neighborhood diversity, and these kind of elements. Thanks.
Okay. Do you want me to start answering?
Yeah,
okay.
please. Thanks.
So, countering online radicalization, is it a waste of time? Is that?
Well, what is being done now?
What's being done now? So for me, there's been a little bit too much focus on the why questions. So why did individuals sign up to that ideology? What is it about the ideology that got them over the line? For me, it's not, and a real focus on sort of let's counter their narratives. I mean, for me, that's not really important. And for me, it's the sort of behaviours that led them to be in that place in the first place. Because I think if you talk to most people about motivation and why, they can't really explain it very well about themselves. They don't really know. They're giving you an answer, but that answer might change in a week, a month, a year, depending on what their new circumstances are. For me, there's a little bit too much focus on the kind of radicalising narratives and not enough on how do people learn to engage in violence against other people, because it's the violence that really matters. For me, people can be extreme as they want. It's only really when they want to get violent about it that I've got an issue with it. So you could be an extreme Liverpool Football Club fan, no problem with that. It's a terrible life choice, but no problem with it. But if you want to do violence, that's when it's kind of over the line. So if you're learning how to make bombs, if it's about psychological conditioning to kill other people, that's where our real focus should be on, in the sort of online countering space. That's me personally, based on my own thing. I mean, and that's backed up by sort of analogous studies of like suicide prevention. Like a lot of the time, some of the better mechanisms to help prevent suicide isn't about sitting down with the person and saying, how do we, you know, get you out of this situation. It's about actually taking away the means through which they're going to kill themselves. So for example, when toxic gas was taken out of ovens in the UK and replaced with normal gas, it led to like a 20% dip in suicides. Those people didn't find another way of killing themselves, they just didn't kill themselves, right? So it's about taking away the means as opposed to the motivation. That's sort of way I look at crime problems, crime control. The second question was to do with gender. I mean, it's always kind of one of those difficult things in that we're talking about a fairly small sample of individuals from a social science perspective, like 150 lone actors, which is a good thing from a sort of living your life perspective, that there hasn't been many lone actors, because it means we're safer and secure. But from a research perspective, it kind of limits the amount of social science research you can do. So women have been about 5% of all of our samples, so they're a really, really small subset. And if you look at the wider violent crime literature, like non-terrorism, women are about 5% there as well. So there's nothing necessarily that different, but yeah. And then societal stuff, yeah, it's a really interesting question. We have a 3-year Minerva funded grant starting, well, it's actually just started, but we're hiring for it, which is looking at those particular questions. Right. So yeah, we're looking at ecologies of radicalization. So it's not necessarily the how or the why, but it's the where. And it's the where questions that are often really heavily overlooked within the study of terrorism and radicalization. Because if you look at who goes over to join Syria, typically it's really heavily, densely clustered in particular towns, communities, streets. It's the same in Northern Ireland, where it was, you know, like could be literally a block of flats where your huge radicalization problem comes from. So that's what we're trying to kind of tap into with that study. But I don't have any answers for you now. But I think there's something in there. There's something about the ecology with which you get exposed to the thing that we need to know more about.
Okay, thank you. Your first comment about the relationship between behaviour and belief.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that would involve, following your path would involve backtracking massively for some governments on the way, you know, for example, the UK, on the way that they perceive what extremism is. But three more questions. I'll come to you if we open. One here. Any others? One here and one back to you again. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sebastian, I'm a communication student here in Brussels. You've already mentioned the stupid TV director and the media attention, but it is the media's role to inform its citizens. However, if all these guys are looking for is fame, then we're pandering to them as well as media organisations. So is there more of a midway line we need to find, or should we just not report lone wolf terrorism at all?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I can answer that.
We'll take another.
Yeah, sorry. My question is the following. I mean, there are some who are saying that since Daesh is pushed in both Iraq and Syria, there will be more lone actors in the next future because I mean the social activities of Daesh is decreasing. And I mean, and do you feel to endorse this assessment?
Okay, cool.
Okay.
Yeah. So the first question, there's definitely a fine line that the media has to play here in terms of reporting it, because obviously it's in the public's interest to know that something has gone down, but I think when you project that guy's face and give him free speech down the camera to say why he did it, I think that goes beyond the kind of public's interest. I like the idea of not having to report their names. Again, from a research perspective, it's going to kill us from our open source stuff, but I think it's for the best, because there is a sort of a contagion effect with these guys. They do latch on to the themes that other people announced. They do latch on to their behaviours because they really identify with it, because they see, here's an individual that has the exact same things going on as me and he did something about it, so it might incentivise people to get the door. But obviously you need to report these issues, but you don't necessarily need to tell so much about the offender. Like if there's a high profile, you know, sexual assault or something like that, they don't talk about the offender as much. They don't, you know, they don't put him up on a pedestal and give out the reasons why he did it, right? They just sort of announce his background and don't give away his personal details. But with terrorism, it's a very different set of reporting. But obviously with, you know, ITV News were the first guys to put up the image of the guy with the bloodied hands. They paid the guy with the mobile phone something like 18,000 quid for that video to be the first ones to do it. Obviously those TV directors are under their own sets of pressures because it's going to go on social media and stuff, so it's a sort of a case by case thing, but I don't think we need to publicise who they are, why they did it, just what they did and what led them there. That's sufficient. So I could go into it in detail. Like I'm sort of obsessed with these guys and their social status stuff, and so we had a guy in London, or sorry, in West Mids in England, Pavlo Lapshin. When he was convicted, he asked the prison officers, "Can I go online now?" And he said, "No, why?" He says, "Oh, I want to see what Anders Breivik is saying about me online." Like, it's just kind of bizarre that, because it is the social status stuff. And I think we do pander to them a little bit too much. And then the other question was related to
more lone actors.
More lone actors, yeah. So I think there's two ways of looking at this. So you've got your ISIS directed individuals, which you got to presume that there's going to be an uptake in that type of stuff, that they're going to want to project more of their, you know, home trained guys to go into Europe and do stuff. They're saying as much, so you'd expect some of them to sort of get over the line. And then there's the other ones that are sort of ISIS inspired, and recently with their communications they've changed the dynamics a little bit to sort of broaden the field about who is allowed to do stuff in their name. So originally in their communiques they were saying, you know, go after cartoonists that depicted Muhammad, go after police, go after soldiers, politicians. So it was a very sort of, you know, most of my day-to-day stuff, I don't meet any of those four categories of people, right? So I don't have the exposure to go ahead and do it. So it was sort of narrowing the field of people that could actually act out on that, because most of them don't travel too far to engage in their crime. More recently, in the Beak, I think it was the last one, they say basically go after anybody, any sort of service member. They depict a picture of a guy selling flowers in Manchester. So they've really broadened the field of people who might be radicalised, have capability, but now they've also got the green light because they're exposed to those now legitimate targets. Whereas beforehand, if you went after that, you were rolling the dice about whether ISIS's media guys would say, yeah, he's one of us or not. But now anything goes, so everybody's going to be claimed, basically. So, and that would be enough to get some people over the line to try and do things.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions? One here?
Yeah, I'm Tommaso Virgili from the European Foundation for Democracy. Going back 1 second to the terminology. In order to be a lone actor, one must have trained himself without having contacts with groups, or if he had contacts with single individuals, he still remained. What's the definition of lone actor, sole actor,
Right.
and so on?
So.
Oh, hang on, Paul, should we take do you have any more before we... Oh no, fine, as you were.
So, for us, in our studies, a lone actor is an individual that conducted the violence or planned to conduct the violence by himself or herself.
Completely by himself.
Yeah. That's not to say that their radicalisation didn't happen within a wider network or milieu, or that they didn't get exposed to stuff online. It's just about the attack. Because from us, from a sort of scientific perspective, that's the easiest point to say they were lone, right? And then we sort of try and backtrace it there. And what we find is that the vast majority of them didn't radicalise in a vacuum. They had other people close to them or online sphere who had similar grievances but just weren't as extreme to act out on it in a violent behalf. We have a smaller subset of people called solo actors, which had training, maybe a little bit of command and control links, and then acted alone. So there's a small distinction there. And that's largely a sort of policing distinction that we pull that from.
Okay. Do we have any more questions before we break for lunch?
Thank you. John Birchall from the Home Office in the UK. you briefly mentioned that the internet might sped up the process of like the planning for lone attackers or the radicalisation process. Was my understanding of that correct? Could you just elaborate on that a bit more, please?
Yeah. So I think if you're planning on doing something by yourself, it's going to take a long time, right? Compared to like a group-based activity where there's a pooling of social talents, previous offending expertise, personal connections. If you're trying to do it all by yourself, there's a lot of things to overcome. So what the internet has provided is almost a how-to guide. So it's not just sort of giving them instructions, but it's actually with the videos and things like that, it sort of shows them the exact behaviours you need to replicate to get over that line. Whereas with other guys that we saw in the 90s, there was a lot of trial and error. There was a lot of sort of testing things out, going from big plan A's and failing. There wasn't a lot of learning from case to case. But now in that online space, a lot of that is being consolidated. So you can just go on and learn where other people made their mistakes. Even Anders Breivik, his kind of compendium basically ends by saying, you know, this took me 10 months to do this, but if you learn from me and don't make the same mistakes, you'll do it in a month. So it's that sort of thing. It's just compressing time and energy. Again, going back to David Copeland, the example with the bomb making, he couldn't do it because YouTube wasn't around and the internet wasn't as ubiquitous. But he had other issues, like he wanted to attack Brick Lane Market, which only runs on a Sunday. He showed up on the Saturday because he, you know, wasn't using Google to say, you know, when's the market on? Anders Breivik 12 years later looked at Google satellite technology to know where to stand on the island to give him coverage from snipers across the water. So everything, like all of our lives have been made a lot easier. Like I came in from the airport today, I knew where to go, it's all on my phone. Whereas if I had it done it 10, 15 years ago, I would have had a big map, would have been lost, would have been late, all that sort of stuff. So it's in the same way it's made all of our lives easier for benevolent purposes. It's done exactly the same. It's the same mechanisms basically for the bad guys too.
Do we have any other questions? Thanks, Paul, for that. Nope. Okay, then it just remains for us to say thank you once again to Paul. A copy of a report that Paul has co-authored on the role of the internet in lone actor terrorism is at the back of the room. Please feel free to take one. There's no seminar next week, but on the 8th, Dr. Matti Pojonen from Finland will be here talking about how the refugee crisis has impacted on discourses online, extremist discourses. So hope to see you then. Thanks very much again, Paul.